Before we take a look at this scope, I have to thank TrollyGag over at the subreddit r/LongRange for making this video possible. He reached out to me some time ago to review this optic because he wanted to put it out there for the world to see, and I greatly appreciate that. R/LongRange really is a big fan of what I do here, and I am very happy that they think so. I think they're an excellent sub, and if you are getting into long range or have any questions or want to just show off your gear, it's a great place to do exactly that. And with that being said, let's now unbox this Leupold Mk4 HD 8-32 by 56. This is a scope that fits a very small niche. I'm not going to say it's a long-range precision rifle scope because I know personally of a lot of people that shoot rimfire precision F-class competitions at 50 yards, and most of their optics are at least a 32x maximum. So I'm not going to say it's a long-range precision. I'm just going to say it is a precision-oriented rifle scope. Primarily one that's probably going to be shot off of a bench more than any other position, but more on that very soon. What Leupold has managed to do with the Mk4 HD series of rifle scopes is keep American-made quality for a very reasonable price. And this price currently on EuroOptic.com is around $1,600, which really doesn't seem like that much money for what you're getting here. Now, Leupold does offer this optic in a couple of different reticle options. This being the PR2, I feel is the best setup for total use of the entire magnification range, being the only one that has a Christmas tree style reticle. The PR3 is kind of like a PR1, but not, so I don't know what they were doing with that, but at least the PR2 seems like a fairly competent reticle that we're going to take a look at very soon. Now, at the time of filming this video for the 8-32, I had already had my 2.5 to 10 by 42 for quite some time, and I thought very highly of the Mk4 HD 2.5 to 10 by that point in time, and I figured that this would be a good evolution of that. But again, I still had my reservations because being an 8-32 might still only make it a 4x multiplier, which is what the entire Mk4 HD lineup of scopes are. But given the fact that it goes to 32x, I sort of had my reservations because at that sort of magnification range, you really start pushing the limits of what the glass is capable of. So that's what I'm going to be mostly curious about with this scope is, can it really perform halfway decently all the way at its maximum? All right, enough talking about the hypothetical. Let's actually get into the physical and the real. One of the main reasons why you buy a Leupold optic is because they're all really lightweight, and this 8-32 is no exception. Given the fact that it's 15.5 inches long and thankfully features a 34mm tube as opposed to the 35mm tube found in the Mk5 HD series, this scope only comes in at about 30 ounces, which is not a lot of weight given its size. Now, it's true, this does not feature illumination, but I feel like for a lot of people that are going to be buying the scope and shooting it for precision groups, they might not really need illumination all that much. So honestly, I think Leupold was just listening to the market and opted not to put illumination on this and make it even more expensive. And as you just saw, comparing it to the Discovery Optics PRS2 rifle scope, this thing comes in 50% lighter than that. That is massive. Just like the 2.5 to 10, the fast focus eyepiece on this is one of the finest fast focus eyepieces I feel on the market. The eyepiece itself is a little bit smaller than the rear objective. However, it is hard to turn, and when you get it in position, the seals sort of lock in on it, so this way it gets really tight and hard to turn, which is excellent. There is also zero wiggle to the eyepiece at all. I really like what Leupold did with this, and I kind of wish other manufacturers would go along with it, because having that sleek sort of extrusion coming out of the rear objective, it not only looks nicer and cleaner, but it also feels a lot better in hand. You'll know when you get your hands on one of them what I'm talking about. Another thing Leupold does a magnificent job on, in my opinion, are the magnification rings. Minimum to maximum is much shorter than the standard 180-degree throw that you find on most other optics. Pair that up with the giant cattail that they have threaded onto the outside, and it makes for one of the most satisfying magnification rings, again, I feel on the market. Its short, fast throw means it's super easy to get it from minimum to maximum with just the flick of a finger, and that cattail is thick, it's knurled, it's rigid. You have a great purchase on it no matter what the conditions are. I've really enjoyed my experience with all of the Mk4 HDs and how their magnification rings are set up. And the same can be said for the Mark Vs and even the Mk3 HDs. I think they should become standard on the entire Leupold lineup, but I doubt we'll ever see that happen. Because there's no illumination, there's nothing to get in the way of just the side parallax being as large of a knob as possible. As you could see, this goes down to a minimum of 25 yards, but actually goes a little bit closer than that. And that goes out to infinity just around 270 degrees. The larger the side parallax knob is, the more finite adjustability we should be able to have on making sure that our target downrange is going to be perfectly in focus. And we will find that out momentarily. As far as how it feels, it's quite good. It's damped well, and it feels pretty rigid, so this way you don't have to worry about it accidentally getting bumped out of its setting. And I do appreciate how large it is. Honestly, there's nothing negative to say about it. As for the turrets, the elevation turret is the exact same that we see on the 2.5 to 10 by 42, but the windage turret in this case is the exact same as the elevation, but it is properly indexed. So you have 0, 1 left, 1 right. And it's the exact same locking mechanism that we have on the elevation, and it works extremely well. So with that all being said, there's nothing else to really talk about physically on this rifle scope. Fit and finish on it are extremely good. Materials feel solid despite how lightweight it is. I really like the matte finish that they go for with this. It doesn't have a high sheen to it, so you don't have to worry about reflections or anything alerting your game or your targets, whatever you want to do downrange. And I really like how this thing is set up overall physically. But our physical relation with an optic is only part of the equation. The other part is actually using it. So let's see if this thing is worth its $1,600 price point. These turrets are good, but they're not Mk4 HD good. You can see there's a little bit of play when both turrets are in the locked position, but once we disengage the lock and we start actually adjusting it, most of that slop goes away. The clicks are good, but they sound a little bit muted, but they feel and lock up pretty solidly. These turrets aren't going to be for everybody. However, no one can deny that if you want to reset your 0 quickly and efficiently, these are really solid for that. Let's check out the PRS2 reticle before we look at the PRS3 and why I think this is a better option. First off, this is available in both MOA and in mils, so you have both flavors out there for whoever might be interested in what. And here at its minimum of 8x, I think this is very clearly legible and easy to read. I feel it offers a fair amount of information without being too complicated and too busy. And as we increase the magnification to its maximum, you can see we have a very fine center aiming dot. Now, some people might not prefer how Leupold opted to indicate the windage and elevation holds with those opposite side markings, but again, it's not going to be for everybody. What I'm illustrating here is just how tight the eye box gets at 32x. It took me a very long time to get the scope properly set up in front of my camera because of that, and more on that very soon. But first, let's take a real quick look at the PRS3 reticle. It's like the PRS2 minus the Christmas tree section. Again, not going to be for everybody, but it's cool that they at least give you the option. However, this only is in mils so far. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the tracking test section for the scope because I feel that an optic like this really should track perfectly if it's going to be considered a precision style optic. As far as our color hues, you could see when we go a little bit too close, we get purple fringing, a little bit too far, we get green fringing. However, the reticle doesn't shift on the target all that much, so it looks pretty good. Same thing when we adjust our magnification. We do not see a shift from the reticle onto the target and vice versa. As far as how the scope is clocked against my target, there is a slight discrepancy at the very bottom at 6 o'clock. The reticle is just to the right of my target, so keep that in mind. You will also note that the elevation looks to be about 0.2 of a mil off, and that is true. We're going to see again, though, if the elevation turret tracks to the reticle or to the target. Let's shift our attention now to a step test. We're going to go 4 mils over and 4 mils up and see how well everything lines up. So far, it looks like the reticle is tracking against those lines flawlessly. And once we get to our end destination, you can see we're about 1/10 of a mil off or so on the windage, and the elevation looks to be pretty solid. So all in all, a pretty good performance so far. Resetting the windage back to 0 is basically bang on perfect where we were, and from there we're going to continue up. Now the paper target is new and it only goes up to 9 mils, but thankfully above the center part of the reticle we can indicate where we are by another full mil to bring it to 10 full mils of added elevation. And at this point you can see that the reticle lines up to the target flawlessly. That is a little alarming though. It's alarming because earlier the reticle didn't line up at the 9 mil mark perfectly to the target. And as I reset the 0 and back out the magnification to show that, you can clearly tell that we are about 2 maybe even 0.3 off with the reticle scaling to my target. And I know my target's pretty damn good because I've tested many optics on this without issue before. So it tracks technically perfectly to the target, but the reticle doesn't seem like it's properly scaled to the erectors. So something to keep in mind there. Again, this is a serving size of 1. Maybe it was just a fluke, but you never know. Taking a trip back into the past, it's the middle part of the fall 2024. We're looking at my 81-yard paper target, and this is a good distance to illustrate what it would look like on a target like that at these distances for those rimfire style shooters. But first, let's quickly pan across my backyard and see how well the PR2 reticle at 8x sort of functions against a very complicated background being, a very wooded area. As you can clearly tell, this thing is not set up for field shooting, in my opinion. I think it's set up far better for the precision style of things, and it makes me wonder, because if the PR2 reticle was found in a 4.5 to 18 or a 5 to 25, it would make it even harder to see in these conditions. So that's absolutely something that you have to keep in mind. Anyway, let's focus now on my semi sort of tracking test target at 81 yards and see how well this optic will perform. Slowly increasing the magnification to its maximum, I have the side parallax set to roughly 81 yards, so we'll see how close it actually gets. So far it looks pretty good, but I am able to fine tune it to get a wonderful looking image, partly in thanks to that side parallax knob being as large as it is. Now, despite the fact that the lighting on this target right now is quite poor, I'd have to say the image looks quite good. You can make out almost all of the numbers going down to a 1/4 inch high at 81 yards, and hell, you can even see some of the staples that I have attaching that target to that piece of wood that is screwed into the tree. Pulling out the magnification back to its minimum, we're now going to focus on a 17-yard target. I'm going to set the side parallax to its minimum and see at what sort of magnification range the image becomes useless. And to be brutally honest, even here at 32x at 17 yards, the image is still quite usable. I'd say there's still a lot of information there, and that really goes to show that this thing is capable of really focusing on fairly close targets. I have no doubt that if that tree was 3 or 4 yards farther back, that we would have gotten a crystal clear, perfect image, just like we do on this tree, which is about 40-ish yards away. All in all, this thing handles itself in these conditions, I feel, extremely well. However, let's now look at the same target a couple hours later, when the sun is gone down a lot of the way. We have a very heavy canopy cover from the trees being still full, so it doesn't have to be really late in the day for this area to get really, really dark. Pulling the camera away from behind the scope, you can clearly tell sort of what we are looking at downrange with the target, more or less towards the center of your screen. Getting back behind the scope, you'll see if that's going to be roughly the same brightness or not. You can already tell that there's a slight darkening to the image when we're looking through the scope at its minimum magnification. And that does not fill me full of confidence when we slowly bring up the magnification to its maximum. That's because I feel the exit pupil on this thing is extremely limited. And as a result of that, it's going to be extremely tight to get behind this thing in lower light conditions. As you can very clearly tell from this illustration of me shifting the camera side to side slightly at 32x. Like we already saw earlier on the reticle portion of this video, it's very, very tight even with decent lighting. But when the lighting is poor, it really just shuts off like a light switch. You go from I can just look through the scope to I can't see anything. Happily, however, the image stability, meaning the reticle sharpness and the target sharpness off center, is extremely good. So yes, it's going to be tight getting behind this thing, and you might be a little bit challenged to do so. At least you know that both the reticle and the target are going to remain in sharp focus to one another, even if you're not behind it perfectly fine. At 8x, you could see that it does perform better than it did at 32, but still not great. It's still very tight. Let's now focus on some farther targets in brighter conditions, albeit with very heavy cloud cover that does come in every once in a while and change the overall dynamic of how we're going to actually look through the scope and see downrange. Anyway, first target is around 500-ish yards away. These solar panels are quite large, but I think they're about 6 feet tall for the larger ones in the back. I think these are a little bit shorter. I got to double check. Brain no worky right now. Anyway, at 8x, again, reticle is decently visible. A little bit harder to see once we are on the solar panel itself, only because of how complicated it is, and the little lines on the solar cells really do wreak havoc with fine reticles. Setting the parallax roughly to our distance, we're going to see again if it's close enough. And the first thing that we notice is, well, yeah, it's got to get tweaked a little bit, but boy, howdy, does that chromatic aberration creep up when you are not in the perfect parallax setting. As I jockey the side parallax knob to get the target perfectly in focus, you can see that it goes from green to purple fringing quite aggressively. Even though I have the side parallax set perfectly, you can very clearly tell that there's a slight purple tint to basically the entire image, specifically on the high contrast areas. Looking at the sky, we have a cloud behind it, and that is always going to emit some sort of chromatic aberration in my findings and my experiences, but this just seems a little bit more so. Backing out the magnification slightly, you could see it seems like it gets a little bit better, but I think just because we're not zoomed in as far, we don't notice it as much. Pulling out the magnification all the way back to its minimum, you can see it basically goes away. Again, I don't know how much of that is just partly due to the fact that we're not focusing on it at a closer distance anymore. As far as the depth of field at 8x, these towers have about 1,000 yards between them. This middle one's around 700 and change. Bring it up to its maximum, we're going to see if we have the same sort of experiences as we did with the first solar cell, but you're going to notice that we're going to have blue skies behind this one, not clouds. So this will be a good representation to see more or less the differences between what the backing is going to do and the contrast on a scope like this. To my eye, it certainly seems less noticeable, but you can clearly tell that on the power lines in the foreground, it is very apparent. For many people, it's not going to make a lick of difference. For some, they actually prefer it because that goes to show that it's not perfectly where it needs to be parallax-wise. For me, I prefer my glass to be as crystal clear as possible and as true to color tones as possible. I don't like it when a scope makes an image really warm or really cool, or has this flip-flop going from green to purple chromatic aberration. It's not my cup of tea. Focusing on our farthest solar panel at 1,000 yards, it actually looks better here than it does at the closer ones. Adjusting the side parallax doesn't seem to draw as much attention to the highlighted chromatic aberration areas. It does, however, still pop up on the far left on that power tower against the clouds, but on the solar panel and to the right, it seems to be a little bit less obtrusive than what we saw on the closer targets. Pulling out the magnification only makes it look a little bit better on the center, but the outside edge at 9 o'clock is still quite aggressive. I haven't really talked much about the actual image clarity, which is probably a shame because I feel this thing produces a very good looking image, but a lot of people are very sensitive to chromatic aberration. In fact, it's a deal breaker for a lot of people, and that's why I really want to highlight this. In the right lighting conditions, it is very apparent and very abrupt and something that you're not going to be able to look past. However, focusing around 2,000 yards, this thing has a great depth of field. So if you are shooting at a farther target and you want a lot of things to be more in focus, this scope is going to be able to bring a lot of what's out there in the field into the same plane of existence. I must stress again, however, that a lot of people prefer the depth of field being very shallow, meaning that they would focus solely on one particular target and nothing else. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that we've been at 0 mils of added elevation this entire time, and I know that no one's going to be shooting out to 1,000 yards and have that be their 0, in most cases anyway. So we focus again on our 1,000-yard solar panel, and we increase our elevation by 10 mils. You might already be able to tell that there's a shadow creeping up at the bottom. This indicates that there's a massive exit pupil shift. Part of the reason for this is I feel, well, it's a 32x on the top end, and the exit pupil is small. I've already talked about that. I don't have the exact numbers, and I forgot to measure it when I had it. However, when we adjust the camera 0, or basically where your cheek weld would be on your rifle to look through the scope, you could see that we don't really lose that much sharpness to the image. It's definitely a little bit softer, but I still feel it's kind of usable. Again, we're at 1,000 yards here. Pulling out the magnification slightly yields a sharper looking image, but again, I feel it's just, we don't notice the imperfections as much. And bringing it back down to its minimum, and you could see just how far we had to shift the camera down on the outside body of the scope to be able to look through it properly. Bringing it back to 0 and not adjusting the camera, you can see we have a long way to go to get behind it perfectly. This is going to be probably a nuisance for some people, especially if you're shooting with a slightly closer 0 and you might push it out to farther distances. At maximum magnification, with the camera perfectly zeroed on the height, we start shifting it side to side, and you can see that even though we're in a fairly bright environment, those shadows creep up quite quickly. Part of the reason why I think the scope is as aggressive as it is in this sort of performance is because the eye relief on this thing is actually really, really far. 3.9 to 4.2 inches is significant. So if you plan on putting this on a very high recoiling gun, you shouldn't have to worry about the scope coming back and biting you in the face. Slowly pulling out the magnification though, and doing the exact same shift, you could see the performance is getting slightly better, as it would on any optic. But again, the image stability is still quite high. The reticle sharpness and the target sharpness are quite good, and I didn't notice any shifting of the reticle on the target in question when the parallax knob was set properly. It could be worse, but it could be better. I wonder if they had opted to design this with slightly closer eye relief at a more standard 3.5 inches, if it would perform better in this test. Again, most people I don't think will even notice this sort of issue, but for some people, they will, and it's going to make the difference of if the scope's going to be right for them or not. Getting into the side-by-side comparisons, the first one's going to be with the one that is on paper the closest to this optic. It's going to be the Bushnell XRS-3. This is a 6-36 by 56 first focal plane rifle scope, just like the Mk4HD. Comes in around the same price. The XRS is about an inch shorter, but weighs 9 ounces more. Now, I was not impressed by the XRS-3 at all for a multitude of reasons, but the biggest thing was the overall image quality was quite poor, especially in the upper magnification range. As you can see between these two at a 100-yard target, yeah, the Mk4 is exhibiting some heavy chromatic aberration, again due to the lighting that we had that particular day. It was a little bit overcast, but the XRS-3 in very bright sunny conditions just looks so soft and ugly. It was never impressive. The Mk4HD, I feel, does a much better job at resoluting the image. Focusing at the 180-yard berm on some pieces of steel. Again, the XRS was filmed in much better lighting conditions. The Mk4HD was filmed on a very overcast day, but it actually plays to this scope's strengths because the chromatic aberration shouldn't be as apparent on lower contrast targets like this piece of steel in this very dark, nasty berm. Between these two, the Mark IV is the clear winner in this regard. Reticle options are good for both of them. I'd really have to think about which one I would prefer between these two scopes, but I'd be fine with either of them for their intended purposes, which would be long-range precision because they have that fine center dot in the middle and a little bit of a gap between the rest of the Christmas tree reticle. One of the biggest differences between these two scopes is that there is a 4x difference on the top end, and that's very clearly illustrated here between these two at 200 yards. So is the chromatic aberration with the Mark IV HD versus the XRS3. Again, lighting conditions definitely play a role in that, but I still feel that the Mark IV has a slightly clearer, cleaner looking image. And as we push it out to 300 yards, that trend still sort of continues. As far as the eye relief between these two scopes, though, they're actually quite similar. The Mark IV I already mentioned was 3.9 to 4.2. The XRS3 is 4 inches. As far as the overall field of view, I didn't even touch on that yet. It is 18 feet with the XRS3 to 13.1, again, that 2x at the minimum, and 3 foot to 3.4 foot, again, that 4x difference on the top end. The XRS3 was so odd that I felt that I had a lemon, but I didn't send it into Bushnell to get checked out. However, if it wasn't a lemon, the Mark IV HD, I feel, greatly surpasses it in overall optical performance. As does the next comparison, the Meopta Optica 6 5-30. This comes in about $600 less expensive than the Mark IV HD, is about the same length and only about 6 ounces heavier. Field of view, because it is a 5-30 as opposed to an 8-32, is going to be heavily favoring the Meopta at 24.6 feet to 13.1 and 37 to 3.4. As far as the eye relief, they're both, again, about the same, 3.9 with the Meopta. Now, the Mark IV HD so far has been quite good, but optically, the Meopta Optica 6 is a freak show, frankly. Just like the 3-18 by 50, this 5-30 is breathtakingly good, especially when we factor in the $1,000 price point that it comes in at. Now, I've never had a solid answer as to where the Optica 6s have been made. Some say that they use European glass, but they're made in China. Some say that they're assembled in Florida. It's something I will never know the answer to, and I've reached out to Meopta a couple of times, and I've never gotten a response back. However, no one can deny how good the image looks on this Optica 6. It's breathtaking. Absolutely breathtaking. The view through the Optica 6 is a little bit on the smaller side, but guess what? So is the XRS3 and so is the Mark IV HD. Partly, again, due to the fact that these all have very long eye reliefs. 4 inches is definitely well above average, and you're going to see that on our next comparison. Here at 180-ish yards on this berm, as good as the Mark IV HD looks, the Optica 6 is definitely going to look better. Reticle options, again, completely personal. You're going to prefer one thing versus the other. However, I'm a big fan of the MRED reticle found with the Meoptas. At 200 yards, yeah, there is a slight magnification difference on the top end of these two, a total of 2x, but it doesn't really appear that different. Chromatic aberration, though, is non-existent with the Meopta, whereas with the Leupold, as you've seen throughout this entire video, it is quite apparent. There's only one thing stopping me from owning a Meopta Optica 6 5-30, and it's not the price, it's not the availability, it is the absolutely nonsensical, non-locking exposed windage turret when the elevation turret is locking. It's a stupid thing, but it's so stupid that I can't justify owning the scope because of how stupid it is. Cap it or put a lock on it, Meopta. That's all you need to do. And this scope, I kid you not, would be one of the best for the price in this segment. But you're not going to listen to me because you never have and you probably never will. And that is really, really unfortunate because this could be, again, one of the finest scopes for the money in this segment. What a shame, ladies and gentlemen. On to our next comparison. It is going to be with the Vortex Razor Gen 3 6-36 by 56. This is like the Mk4 HD, but in excess in every single way. Starting with the price. Basically twice the price of the Mk4 HD. They're about the same length, but it also comes in 50% heavier than the Mk4 HD. Its field of view is 21.3 to 13.1 feet and 3.5 to 3.4. That black magic effery that I usually talk about is because of the more traditional eye relief at 3.5-ish inches. And that makes a huge difference. Not only that, it's a Razor, and the OEMs that build the Razor HDs do an amazing job of giving you a giant view through it with a very small perimeter of the scope that you'll see, and just wonderful optics. The Gen 3 6-36 is absolutely no exception to this rule. It is frankly breathtaking. It's beautiful. It feels substantial in hand, and all of the controls are, well, basically as good as you could possibly get. But the price is going to turn a lot of people off, especially if all you're going to be doing is sitting on a bench and putting holes in paper downrange. Maybe you don't need such an elaborate, extravagant, robust optic like the Gen 3 Razor. Nor maybe you want something that's as heavy as it, unless you're really trying to mitigate recoil, in which case the heavier the gun, the better. But if your budget doesn't allow for something like the G3, fear not, because there are other optics that can come close to how the G3 performs. I think the Mk4 HD is quite good. I definitely think that for an American-made optic, while still maintaining a fairly reasonable price point, it's a good overall optic. But something like the Gen 3 Razor is just going to be better in almost every way, shape, and form. However, some of the things that I already talked about might be shortcomings for you, like the weight, for example. Again, though, different strokes for different folks. At 300 yards is where you're really going to see the difference between these two optics. Lighting conditions for the Gen 3 were the exact same as with the XRS3 because they were filmed on the exact same day. But that just goes to show you how much better the Razor is as opposed to the XRS3. Because here at 300 yards, wow, does that just look fantastic. You could see the X on the X-ring at 300 yards with the G3, and even the 10, 9, 8, and 7 rings. The Mk4 HD does look good. You can count all of the 1-inch squares on those shoot-and-see targets. But if you had to pick one winner between these two, it's going to be the Gen 3, despite the overwhelming price point. But again, if it's out of your budget, there are other options. Just like this next one. The Bushnell Match Pro ED 5-30x56. This comes in less than half the price of the Mk4 HD. It's the exact same length. It's only 2 ounces heavier. Its overall field of view is going to be different, again, because of the difference in the magnification range, 24.5 to 13.1 and 4.1 to 3.4. Eye relief is actually also going to be quite similar to the Mk4 HD at an indicated 3.8 inches. Despite that, though, the view through the Match Pro ED rivals that of the Gen 3 Razor HD. It is huge. It is large and impressive. And unlike the Mk4 HD, it offers illumination if you needed it in a certain environment. It's really nice to have. Not for everybody, but I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Optically, the Match Pro ED punches well above its price point. Given the fact that it's half the price of the Mk4 HD, I feel it easily rivals what the Mk4 HD is capable of. Reticle options, again, personal, but the Match Pro ED is a little bit on the, well, not a little bit, it's a lot busier than what we see with the PRS2, and that's fine because it's still usable at the minimum or the maximum magnifications. Still offers a fairly fine center dot, albeit with a little bit less of a gap around it. So if you're really trying to get that perfect, precise shot on center, it's going to be a little bit trickier with the Match Pro ED. But there's really nothing else negative to say about the MPED. I think it's still one of the best options on the market, especially for the price point. Would I rather spend the $300 and buy the Optica 6 over the Match Pro ED? If the Meopta had a capped windage, absolutely. I would justify that costs expenditure. However, it doesn't. And the Match Pro ED is less expensive by almost 50% over the Optica 6. And well, it still looks really, really good at distance. Sure, the image at 200 yards a little bit grainier with the MPED, but that was a very hot, humid day in the summer that I filmed with it, and that's going to wreak havoc with its overall optical performance, especially compared to when I filmed with the Mk4HD, which was a clear, crisp autumn day. Between these two, though, could I say that they're direct competitors against one another? Yeah, I would say the magnification ranges are close enough, the controls and features are close enough, and the price points are, well, relative to where they're made and how they're sort of built. As great as the MPED is, it still feels like a Chinese-made optic, whereas the Mark IV, well, doesn't. But if your budget is already being pushed to its limit with the Mark IV HD, something like the MPED might be absolutely perfect for you. I've talked a lot about this optic, both its pros and its cons. Ultimately, I still feel it's a pretty decent option in this high-powered variable optics segment. It's American-made. It doesn't cost a ton of money. It has quite good optical performance, very good controls and setup overall, and comes with a great warranty. The PRS-2 reticle, I think, is a very nice fit for the particular style of shooting that this optic is primarily going to be used in. But if you don't like the Christmas tree reticle, don't worry, Leupold's got you covered with the PRS-3, albeit in mils only. To me, that's not a real big deal, but people like Hoplophile still prefer MOA for some odd reason. This scope, however, is not without its flaws. I've already talked about them ad nauseum, so I'm just going to highlight them real quick. Chromatic aberration is definitely apparent, especially in particular lighting environments. The reticle, at least in this particular scope, did not line up to my tracking target perfectly. However, it did track to my tracking target perfectly. Go figure. Another thing is, if you start dialing for elevation, that exit pupil is going to shift up and down. So you're going to have to adjust your cheek weld and your head position behind the optic to take full advantage of that. The 8x minimum is really going to limit what your minimum contact distance is going to be for this thing. And that's particularly why I think this is better suited for benchtop shooting, because add all these factors together, you have an 8x minimum, you have a tight eye box, and a shifting exit pupil, and now you've really got to wonder, in what sort of other environments are you really going to be able to use this scope? That's why benchtop shooting or prone shooting, more precision shooting, whether you're at closer distances or further distances, those are all the things you're going to have to keep in mind and weigh out the pros and the cons with this to see if it's going to be right for you. However, if it's not right for you, happily, if you want to stick with something of similar magnification, there are a ton of other options, both in the lower and higher price points. And maybe you might even wonder to yourself if this magnification range is going to be right for you. Well, again, happily, there are a ton of different optics in a ton of different magnification ranges out there, and I guarantee you there's a perfect fit for you out there somewhere. You just have to find it. To wrap this up nice and neat, I'm going to leave it like this. It is an American-made scope for a decent price that has really good build quality and really good feature sets. It offers a lot of bang for your buck if you're looking for a higher magnification scope. However, it is not without its limitations, and those limitations must be understood first. If you're okay with the limitations, I think you're going to do quite well with this scope, especially if you like lighter weight builds. At 30 ounces, this is really something to behold. And on that note, a very huge thank you to TrollyGag and the entire LongRange community. There are a bunch of great people over there, and they have a wealth of knowledge. If you have any questions or any sort of recommendations that you're looking for, definitely go and check them out. And of course, a huge thank you for all of you for staying tuned and watching this 38-minute and 45-second long video. I couldn't do it without you. So, thank you all very much for watching. And as always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you can still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.